SPV is the new acronym on the media market when it comes to Iran. An SPV is a special purpose vehicle to facilitate financial transactions and therefore trade. Europe promised Iran this new financial channel to save the JCPOA or Iran nuclear deal. That was months ago, and a big chunk of Iran thinks Europe is testing its patience. It makes it wonder. JCPOA, yes or no? Iran decided yes when in May the US pulled out of the deal. Again, the question has arisen. This time the response would depend on whether Europe will commit to Iran and the deal. But how far can Europe commit in the face of US bullying to get industry going and trade flowing between Iran and Europe? For answers, stay with me, Leila Faramarzi. Europe has already taken about 7 months to get an SPV up and running, but either of the two Euro giants, Germany and France, are expected to host the SPV, which is a clearinghouse, just before or after New Year 2019. So the SPV is to rescue a European JCPOA by securing European trade in and with Iran. How would the SPV or clearinghouse do this? It would allow European companies to bypass US sanctions by serving as a barter exchange which is neither connected to the US dollar nor requires monetary transfers between Iran and EU countries. It will just coordinate payments so that exporters can be paid from funds outside of Iran, while importers can be paid by funds within Iran. This form of compensation has been used informally for years, but Europe is now formalizing it as the next best thing after its blocking statute to rescue what's come to be known as the European JCPOA. That's the JCPOA minus the US.
In fact, the blame falls to some extent on the Iranian negotiators. They actually failed to see the future of the American administration. They knew that Obama's presidential days were coming to an end, and yet they were not circumspect enough to predict the future of the deal if a crazy Republican candidate like Trump wins the election. They should have insisted on adding parts to the deal that would prevent the foreign companies from leaving Iran. One of the biggest loopholes in the JCPOA is that.
Europe engineered the JCPOA, so apart from economic gain, saving the deal is a matter of honor, as it is a guarantor of security in Europe. Before the SPV, it had revived its blocking statute. That was to prevent European companies from abiding by US regulations. To put it in the words of the European Commission itself, the blocking statute allows EU operators to recover damages arising from US extraterritorial sanctions from the persons causing them and nullifies the effect in the EU of any foreign court rulings based on them. It also forbids EU persons from complying with those sanctions, unless exceptionally authorized to do so by the Commission in case non-compliance seriously damages their interests or the interests of the Union. The authorizations will be done on the basis of agreed criteria, which will also be issued on 7th August.
The
issue of the JCPOA and the Europe is not limited to the issue of economy only. To the EU countries, it's also a matter of prestige. It's actually sort of beneath their dignity to leave the deal. If in this deal they are announcing support more for Iran, it's because they are trying to defend their dignity and prestige as well.
Europe, which borders Eurasia at its western tip, originally birthed the US, which is now policing the world and weaponizing economic policy. And so Europe has yet another incentive to play a bigger, more independent part in this long tail. It wants the euro to stand in a more developed role in foreign exchange markets. Iran is alerted to this issue. Ali Akbar Salehi, head of Iran's Atomic Energy Organization, said, "Of course, Brussels and the European Commission have stated that Europe has plans to use the euro for oil transactions with other countries if the volume is more than 300 billion euros.
I can say that Britain does want to see the Iran nuclear deal survive. Britain has started to forge quite significant links with Iran in the last few years, and the same can also be said of France and Germany. Iran is a significant market for those three EU countries, and therefore it benefits the British economy, the German economy and the French economy. And I do believe that Berlin, Paris and London are genuine in their support of the Iran nuclear deal.
Oil is of such importance to Iran that Donald Trump's last wave of sanctions were termed oil sanctions. And the SPV, many critics say, will have a negligible impact on Iran's economy, as it probably won't facilitate Europeans purchasing Iranian oil. Europe has several pointers and tactics in mind for reducing its dependence on the dollar. Its intended SPV is instrumental in the plan. An SPV could take many forms. One form could be the clearinghouse for companies that transfer money to Iran to repatriate funds from the country or engage in a form of barter trade with it. On the barter proposals, say an EU firm can buy oil from Iran, as the SPV would arrange for the cost to be netted off by another firm selling into Iran. This would reduce the need for currency or bank transactions. In the face of US sanctions, Europe may introduce its planned SPV as a humanitarian vehicle. This would protect the SPV as it takes its first steps, because humanitarian goods, primarily food and medicine, are exempt from US sanctions, and the organizers of a humanitarian SPV should not be subjected to sanctions. Sadly for US sanctions, however, they have failed in their path before they've even stood up, to go by Richard Nephew. To quote the sanctions expert, he said, "What we are hearing out of Russia, China and Europe about finding alternative payment systems is going ultimately be pretty detrimental both to general globalization and economic integration, but also to the use of sanctions as a tool of the US. Anyone who has studied US foreign policy enough knows that just because something is inevitably not in our interest does not mean we are going to stop doing it in the short term. All ado is about finding a way around US sanctions on oil, metals, insurance and whatnot. It's an ordeal the US could have avoided by not backing out of the JCPOA in the first place. Iran had already suffered a decade of crippling sanctions, and the JCPOA lifted them for reassurances from Iran, which left no cause for continuing with sanctions. The JCPOA may be an old tale now, but it's an ongoing tale, and its details still matters. But before more on that deal, let's take a look at other media outlets. So what do other media outlets have to say? Beginning with South China Morning Post, which gives us insight and opinion into US sanctions against Iran, which are purely political. There are villains and criminals aplenty in this sorry Iran saga, but sanction breakers are hardly the worst of them. Behind the facade of legality, America's sanction laws are usually no more than the conduct of foreign policy by other means. When it comes to Iran, it is blatantly obvious. One can only shake one's head when American prosecutors go after foreigners with long jail time while portraying them as criminals for breaching US-imposed sanctions. Next is Gulf News Tech. Iran sanctions, top Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou detained in Canada, angering China. China is working creatively to undermine our national security interests, and the United States and our allies can't sit on the sidelines. U.S. Senator Ben Sasse said this in a statement linking the arrest to U.S. sanctions against Iran. Next is Arab news. Iran says to continue missile tests after U.S. allegation. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo on Saturday condemned what he called Iran's testing of a medium-range ballistic missile in violation of the 2015 International Agreement on the Iranian Nuclear Program, from which Washington has withdrawn. Well, it is called the nuclear program, and it was to limit Iran's nuclear program, not ballistic missile testing. And Iran said on Sunday it would continue missile tests to build up its defenses, and denied this was in breach of UN resolutions following US allegations that Tehran had tested a new missile capable of carrying multiple warheads. Next is FP, Foreign Policy. How Europe could blunt US-Iran sanctions without Washington lifting a finger. When European Union Foreign Policy Chief Federica Mogherini announced the European intention to establish an SPV in September, she specifically mentioned the aim of facilitating payments related to Iran's oil exports. European officials privately concede this is unlikely to happen. The JCPOA, or Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action of 2015, became operational in 2016. It demanded Iran limit its nuclear program in return for economic UN sanctions to be lifted off the Middle Eastern petropower. Europe seized the opportunity, and scores of European companies and conglomerates poured in to set up shop in this re-virginized territory post-revolution. The excitement was mutual, and Iranians were ready to embrace. But in the hustle and bustle, the US was left behind, and the JCPOA US president didn't have enough time in office to see the deal through to its fullest and fully functioning. His successor, Donald Trump, pulled out of the deal on 8 May 2018, promising the reimposition and further tightening of sanctions. But on what grounds?
Ladies and gentlemen, I informed the board that Iran is implementing its nuclear-related commitments under the JCPOA. It is essential that Iran continues to fully implement these commitments.
The UN nuclear watchdog has reported just under 15 times that there is nothing to report. Iran is clean nuclear weapon-wise. Nothing to be found, except for Iran's compliance with the nuclear deal. But the US then demanded Iran scrap its ballistic missile program and limit its involvement in the Middle East. Did I mention Iran was in the Middle East? It's a Middle Eastern country.
I believe that the conflict between Iran and the US is a matter of nature and has got nothing to do with issues like economical interests or security. The things that America referred to for sanctioning Iran, like Iran's missile power or its influence in the region, are sheer lies. The US knows well that its accusations against Iran are completely baseless, and that's why it left the deal immediately, because they knew that they would not find any violations of international law in Iran's activities.
The JCPOA was to improve Iranian life and give foreign business a better chance in Iran. But has it? And how is domestic industry doing? I'm off to see a faucet factory director for better insight into the issue. Do come along. If water is a vital means of comfort and hygiene, it's these pipes and taps that make that water accessible to people. Ideyano, a New Idea production group, has managed to keep up the good work in spite of sanctions, no thanks to JCPOA.
ما تا آخرین نفسی که داریم ادامه میدیم We will resist until our last breath. We usually import some of the parts that we need in our production from China and some other countries. But thanks to the sanctions today, we are producing them inside Iran. But in terms of raw materials, I should admit that we are going through a hard time. For example, we used to import some sort of a spring from China, but after the sanctions hit, we were confronted with restrictions on its imports, so we began to produce it immediately. And I assure you that in terms of quality, it is much better than its Chinese equivalents. I also need to add that there are some parts which cannot be produced domestically because we do not have the required technology here. We need time to adapt to the shortcomings caused by the sanctions.
From the faucet factory, we set out for another industry to see how they're doing in the face of sanctions. The next was Isuda, an old chocolate factory. Perhaps you were expecting hard industry. There's that too. Or perhaps you were expecting the most modern factory. No need. Iran is perfectly capable of turning the wheels to run its economy, even if those wheels are not the latest model. An Isuda factory depends more than anything on its own muscle power, with some help from the government.
During the sanctions before the JCPOA, Iranian producers went through a very hard time, but fortunately they found a way to continue their businesses. They did not give up. This time, sanctions have been reinstated even harder than before. But I say that this time too, the producers will find a way around the sanctions. It is hard, but it is not impossible. Producers who have strived for many years and worked hard to become a brand, to win a place in the country's economy, will never cease making efforts.
The US cannot force all the world countries to cease their economic relations with Iran. For example, Afghanistan, for part of its need to drugs and food, is dependent on Iran. Iraq needs Iran's food and drugs too, and many other countries of the sort which fortunately have big markets for Iran's productions. But Iranian negotiators should have the required skills for signing agreements and benefit all the parties. I believe that world-famous companies are willing to have trade relations with Iran through different means, for example through third party. We don't mind if an investor of the Netherlands makes investments in Iran through the channel of its Chinese representative. This all depends on our foreign policy and management.
If it's all about foreign trade saving the day, it's time to make a mention of major foreign businesses that pulled out of Iran reluctantly, and those who, in spite of US threats, have stayed put. Who are they, and why did they decide for or against trade with Iran? Not to forget the significance of small businesses these days, who may turn out to be Iran's best friends from Europe, as the US has no stakes in them, and they have nothing to lose by disobeying US sanction edicts. Here's a list of some of the larger companies that pulled out of Iran for fear of US retribution. Total, Maersk, Peugeot, GE or General Electric, Honeywell, Boeing, Lukoil, Reliance, Dover, and Siemens.
In the Iran nuclear deal, or the JCPOA, the only obligations which have been implemented fully so far pertains to the annex that speaks of Iran. And this is while the annex, which are related to the obligations of other parties of the deal, have been completely ignored as a result of the US bullying and law-breaking.
On the other hand, there were those major companies that were listed as stayers, at least for a while, such as CNPC, the Chinese oil company, the China Railway Engineering Corporation, Ansaldo Energia, CRRC Corp, or the Changchun Railway Vehicles Corporation, and the Bharat Petroleum Corporation.
In fact, the EU cannot fulfill its commitments, even if it wants to, and it's mainly because of the US's economic power. Moreover, even the EU blocking regulation is not comprehensive and strong enough to stand against the EU's sanctions. because it has geographical limitations, meaning that it is limited only to the small companies which are inside the EU, while many of their big companies have branches in the US and their money transactions are entirely dependent.
Unfortunately, we live in a world where money talks, and the Americans are not only putting the EU under an extraordinary amount of pressure to walk away from the Iran nuclear deal, but the Americans also, to put it colloquially, flashing the cash. They're saying to the Europeans, well, you can have the Iranian market, or you can have the American market, a market of 300 million people. And of course, the hidden message there from the Americans is, if you want to pursue the Iran nuclear deal, go ahead, but that may have ramifications for your access to the American market. Now, of course, in a business sense, it's prudent for America, Britain and France to focus on the American market. That is no disrespect to Iran or to the Iranian market, but of course the American market is absolutely enormous. So the Germans and the French and the British don't want to jeopardize their access to the American market for the sake of Iran. It's sad to say, but that's business, and money makes the world go round.
Just before the final blow by sanctions in November, October witnessed how some European companies were driven out of Iran. Iran still has its eastern allies that proved too stoic or independent for US sanctions to blow them away. Those are Chinese, Indian and Turkish businesses that may prove to be crucial in offsetting the economic damages inflicted by US sanctions and upholding the nuclear deal, rather than any SPV. The long list of levers has given rise to the question, are Europe and the US in a conspiracy together and just playing good cop, bad cop with Iran?
The parliament has passed a law named the Reciprocal and Proportional Action in Implementing the JCPOA Act. The second article of the law requires the Iranian government to take reciprocal measure if the other signatories of the deal violate their obligations under the deal. The political deputy at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Araqchi, once said that after the US walked away from the Iran nuclear deal, JCPOA, the deal lost its balance, and like a patient has been taken to the ICU. My diagnosis is a bit different. I believe that this deal suffers a brain death, does not have any vital signs anymore, and will not recover. The deal is more like a piece of paper which does not benefit anyone. Meetings are held between Iranian and European countries, but to no avail.
An important question is if the US could so easily pull out of a multilateral international deal, the JCPOA, how can Iran depend on any international organizations? Leave your comments and topic requests. Thanks for watching.